On my wedding day, my sister Vanessa showed up wearing a pure white dress, not cream, not ivory, not champagne, pure white, like a bride's gown. What began as an uncomfortable surprise ended up becoming the worst moment of my life and something I still can't bring myself to forgive. I'm going to tell this in the most direct way possible because every time I try to tell it differently, I end up circling secondary details, and what matters here are the facts and the order in which they happened. No unnecessary embellishments. Just what happened. I got married on a Saturday in September to the man I had been with for 4.5 years. His name is Daniel. The wedding was in an outdoor garden venue, with a little over 120 people, including both families, close friends, and some co-workers. We had planned everything for nearly a year and a half, with that level of detail that comes from people who understand that important events don't go well by accident, but because someone spent many hours thinking through every part of the process. One of those details was the dress code. I communicated it explicitly, well in advance, to everyone who needed to know. It wasn't restrictive or complicated, it simply asked that no one wear white, cream, ivory, or champagne. Warm light tones in general were something we preferred to avoid. It was a standard guideline, the kind most adults understand without needing a detailed explanation of why the convention exists. I told my mom in person. I told my bridesmaids during one of the planning meetings. I included it in writing in the message I sent to both families with all the wedding details, location, time, parking, dress code. And I told my sister Vanessa specifically in a face-to-face conversation that took place about 2 months before the wedding, when she asked if she could wear a dress she had recently bought. That conversation happened in a cafe on a Sunday afternoon. Vanessa pulled out her phone and showed me a picture of the dress. She described it as off-white, almost cream, very delicate. I told her I understood it was beautiful, but that I preferred she choose something else, that the shade was exactly the area I wanted to avoid, and that I'd be happy to go with her to find something different if she wanted. She looked at me, nodded, and said it was fine, that she understood perfectly, and that she would look for something else. That was the last time we talked about it. I assumed it was settled because reasonable people resolve things when they say they've resolved them. That's the assumption you make about the people you love. And in Vanessa's case, it was an assumption I had held for years, despite accumulating evidence that it didn't always hold up. Vanessa and I are our parents' only 2 daughters. She is 2 years older than me. Our relationship was never the kind of best friends dynamic where you share everything and talk every day. We were close in the family sense, which is a real kind of closeness, just a different one from the kind you choose. We loved each other. We spent time together at family events, spoke regularly, caught up on each other's lives. But there was always a dynamic between us that I learned to navigate from a young age without ever naming it to anyone, and not fully even to myself, because naming it would have required saying things about my sister that were easier not to say. Vanessa has a way of existing in shared spaces that makes her presence slightly larger than the context requires or invites. Not in an aggressive or deliberately obstructive way. In that constant way of hers, of occupying more space than strictly belongs to her at any given moment. A comment that subtly redirects attention from the correct center toward her. A gesture that reframes the situation so she becomes more visible. A way of inserting herself into someone else's main moment that is soft enough that pointing it out feels excessive, and consistent enough that the person who should be at the center can feel it fully. I had seen it at family birthdays where someone else was being celebrated. I had seen it at a cousin's graduation where Vanessa arrived in a dress that was clearly too formal for the context and sparked comments for weeks. I had seen it at a friend's baby shower where she offered to help organize and ended up more visible in the event photos than the expectant mother. I had noticed it. I had processed it. I had let it go each time with some version of the same justification, that she was my sister, that it wasn't malicious, that family dynamics are complicated and turning every small thing into a conflict creates more problems than it solves. What I had not properly assessed was the limit of how far that pattern could go when the event in question was important enough. On my wedding day, I understood that limit in a way I won't forget. The morning was exactly what I had imagined in the best sense, chaotic in that specific kind of pleasant chaos, full of movement and nervous laughter and small unexpected issues that resolved themselves before becoming real problems. I got ready in the hotel room where we had stayed the night with my bridesmaids. My mom was there for part of the morning. Makeup took longer than planned. Someone spilled something on a towel and there were 5 minutes of panic that ended in laughter. Everything unfolded with that quality of moments you've waited a long time for, and when they finally arrive, they produce something closer to disbelief than simple emotion. Vanessa wasn't part of that preparation. She wasn't a bridesmaid and there was no particular reason for her to be there. I was going to see her at the ceremony, like the rest of the guests. The ceremony was scheduled for 5 in the afternoon. At 4:45, when I was fully ready and waiting with my dad in the holding area just before the garden entrance, one of my bridesmaids came into the room. Her name is Lisa, and I've known her since high school. She came in with an expression I couldn't immediately read because it was a combination of things that don't usually go together: concern, discomfort, and something like the uncertainty of someone who doesn't know whether what they're about to say will help or make things harder. She told me there was something she thought I needed to know before going out. I asked what. She paused briefly, the kind of pause people make when they're actively searching for the least impactful way to say something that will still be impactful no matter how they phrase it. She told me that Vanessa had arrived wearing a white dress. Not cream, not ivory, not champagne, not a light shade that could be interpreted differently. White. The white that doesn't allow qualifiers. I stared at Lisa for several seconds without saying a single word. My dad was beside me, and I could feel him shift in that small, barely noticeable way people do when they just process something difficult and are still searching for the right response without finding it yet. I asked Lisa if she was absolutely sure it was white and not just a very light shade that, under the late afternoon garden light, could look whiter than it actually was. I asked not because I expected the answer to change anything, but because I needed that extra second of time that comes from asking a question before having to respond to information you've already received. Lisa said yes, she was sure, that she had deliberately looked twice before coming to tell me precisely so she wouldn't alarm me without reason, that she had mentally compared Vanessa's dress to other light-colored dresses among the guests, and that Vanessa's was unequivocally white in the sense that leaves no room for debate. My dad said something quietly. I don't remember exactly what, but it was in that register fathers use when they want you to know they are on your side without yet knowing what being on your side actually means in that specific situation. The first thing I felt wasn't anger. It was disbelief, which is a different state and in some ways harder to handle because anger has a clear direction and disbelief does not. It was that specific feeling when something happens that you theoretically knew was possible, but in practice had never processed as a real possibility because doing so would have required you to assume things about a person you didn't want to assume. I knew Vanessa was capable of many things. I had seen her do many things over the years, but this had a different level of deliberateness than anything before it, because in order to arrive at that garden wearing that dress that day, Vanessa had to make a sequence of active decisions: choose that dress, put it on, look at herself in the mirror, remember the conversation we had 2 months earlier, and proceed anyway. At no point in that chain had there been a moment of hesitation. I told my dad I didn't want him to talk to her. I didn't want any scene before the ceremony. I didn't want anything happening in that moment to contaminate what was about to take place in the garden. He nodded. He looked relieved to have a clear instruction. I asked Lisa if anyone else knew, if there had been any comments among the guests. She said some people had noticed but no one had said anything out loud yet. I told her I wanted it to stay that way, that no one should say anything, that I didn't want any intervention of any kind before or during the ceremony. If anyone directly asked her what to do, the answer was to do nothing. I breathed in. I adjusted my dress, which was exactly the one I had chosen after trying on 12 different options in 4 different stores over several months. I fixed my hair, which didn't need fixing. I told my dad I was ready. We walked into the garden. There are moments in life that you imagine so many times, in so much detail, that when they finally happen they take on a quality that feels halfway between real and unreal, difficult to describe with precision. Walking down that aisle toward Daniel was exactly that. He was standing at the front in the suit we had chosen together months earlier, with an expression on his face that took me several steps to identify because it was too honest to be something he had prepared or rehearsed. It was the expression of someone seeing something they genuinely care about and not trying to manage it or present it in any particular way. It was his real face. I saw Vanessa when the aisle brought me past her row. She was seated on the left side, toward the front, as is appropriate for immediate family. The dress was exactly what Lisa had described. It was a structured white dress, moderate neckline, floor length, with a silhouette that in any other context would have been perfectly appropriate. In that context, it was what it was, and there was no way for it to be anything else. She looked up as I passed. She smiled. It was the normal smile of someone watching her sister walk toward the altar on her wedding day, completely natural, with no sign of discomfort or awareness of anything in particular. I don't know what I would have preferred to see on her face in that moment. Maybe something that would have given me information about what she was thinking. Maybe nothing would have been better than what I saw. I kept walking toward Daniel. I reached him. I took his hand. The ceremony was exactly what I had wanted it to be. The words we said were ours, built by the two of us over weeks of conversations about what we wanted to say and how we wanted to say it. The moment we exchanged rings was exactly as I had imagined it. The people we cared about were there. The garden looked exactly as we had planned it. Nothing that happened in that ceremony was tainted by what Vanessa was wearing. But when the ceremony ended and the reception began, what I had been holding in since 4:45 that afternoon started finding the cracks through which it could escape, and what happened in those following hours is the part I still struggle to process in a way that feels resolved. The reception began with cocktails in the garden, taking advantage of the evening light that at that hour created exactly the kind of atmosphere we had wanted when we chose the time for the ceremony. Then came the transition into the indoor hall for dinner and dancing, the moment when a wedding shifts tone from something ceremonial and heavy with meaning to something looser, more social, louder in the good sense. I was moving around with Daniel, doing what you do in that part of a wedding, greeting people, receiving hugs, listening to comments about the ceremony, making sure I crossed paths with everyone who had traveled from far away to be there. It was that kind of circulation that requires you to be present and attentive to many things at once without being able to linger too long on any of them. It was in that context, that constant movement, that I began to notice the pattern. I didn't notice it all at once. I noticed it gradually, photo by photo, over the first 40 minutes of the cocktail hour. In practically every photo someone showed me on their phone, or that I saw being taken around me, Vanessa appeared. Not in a way that could be immediately identified as intentional in any single image. But once the pattern became visible, it was impossible to stop seeing it. She was always on the perimeter of what the camera captured. If someone took a photo of Daniel and me with a group of friends, Vanessa would be 2 people behind us, fully visible, wearing that white dress that, under the garden's evening light, looked if anything even whiter than indoors. If someone photographed the main table, Vanessa was in the background but still inside the frame. If someone captured a general moment of the cocktail hour, Vanessa was there too. Not doing anything specific. Not gesturing or drawing attention in any obvious way. Just positioned in a way that kept her inside the frame with a consistency that didn't feel random. I first noticed it when a friend showed me a photo she wanted to send me that same night. It was Daniel and me, 2 of his close friends, and behind us Vanessa was in the visual foreground wearing the dress. The friend didn't say anything about the dress because she didn't know the context. She just wanted to share the photo because it had turned out well. I looked at it, said it was nice, and moved on with the night. I noticed it a second time when the photographer showed us some shots during a brief break between the cocktail hour and the entrance into the hall. I quickly scrolled through the thumbnails on his screen and saw the same pattern repeated across multiple images. I didn't say anything because it wasn't the time or place, and because the photographer had no responsibility for where guests chose to stand. By the time we reached dinner, I was carrying that specific kind of weight that comes from noticing something and choosing not to actively process it because the context doesn't allow it, but it's still taking up mental space you need for everything else. At some point between dinner and the first dance, Lisa and I went to the restroom together. It was there, in those 5 minutes outside the hall, that I let go of part of what I had been carrying since 4:45. I didn't cry. That mattered to me in a practical way at the time. I didn't want to arrive at the first dance with red eyes or the face of someone who had been crying, because that was a moment that would be in the photos and in the memories of the people there, and I wanted it to look right. So I didn't cry. But I did say out loud, with the clarity that comes from speaking something for the first time outside your own mind, what I had been thinking. I told Lisa this wasn't carelessness. Carelessness is arriving in a shade that looks different under different lighting than it did at home. Carelessness is not reading the dress code properly. Carelessness is not remembering a conversation from 2 months ago. But none of that was what had happened here, because I had specifically told Vanessa I preferred she not wear that dress. She had said she understood, and she had still shown up at my wedding wearing it. That wasn't carelessness. That was a decision. Lisa listened without interrupting me. When I finished speaking, she asked if I wanted to talk to Vanessa that night. I told her no, that if I did it in that moment there would be a scene, and that a scene at my wedding reception would become a memory that would stay with everyone who was there, including me, and I didn't want my wedding to be remembered for that. I washed my hands. I looked at myself in the mirror. I made sure there was no visible trace on my face of what I had just said. I went back to the hall. I danced with Daniel. We danced to that first song we had chosen after weeks of listening to options, and when it played in the hall it was exactly what we had wanted it to be. I cut the cake. I was present for every part of the rest of that night in the way I had wanted to be present, completely, without anything else occupying the center. Vanessa danced. She spoke with people. She had a few drinks. She behaved for the rest of the night like any wedding guest who was having a good time. At the end of the night, when almost everyone had left and only the closest people remained, gathering things and making those final comments people make when an important event has just ended, Vanessa came up to me. She hugged me. She smelled like her usual perfume. She told me it had been a beautiful wedding. She told me it was clear that Daniel and I were very happy together. She said it with a warmth that felt completely real, in the way Vanessa can be both completely genuine and completely herself at the same time, which is one of the most confusing parts of our relationship because those two things coexist in her without canceling each other out. I hugged her back. I told her thank you for coming. Nothing more. That was it for that night. But what came 3 days later, when Daniel and I returned from the days we took alone after the wedding and I started receiving the photographer's photos, completely changed the scale of what had happened that day. The photographer was good. That was exactly the problem, or at least part of it. He had done his job with the level of quality and detail you expect when you pay what you pay for a professional wedding photographer, which meant that in the final image archive every element of that day was documented with a clarity and permanence that lived memory simply doesn't have in the same way. Lived memory has distance. It has the possibility of reinterpretation. Photographs don't have any of that. I opened the folder that afternoon, sitting in the living room of the apartment Daniel and I shared, with a glass of wine and the specific anticipation of someone who has been waiting for days to see the images of one of the most important days of their life. The first photos were from the hotel preparations, my bridesmaids, the details of the dress and the bouquet. The next ones were from the arrival at the garden, Daniel waiting at the front, guests taking their seats. And then I reached the cocktail hour photos. There was one image taken from a raised angle, probably from a platform or some elevated point the photographer had found to capture the full perspective of the space during the cocktail hour. In that photo, Daniel and I appeared with our backs to the camera, facing the group of guests in front of us. We were the only two in white in the frame. Except we weren't the only two in white in the frame, because Vanessa was positioned exactly in the center of the group in front of us, facing the camera, wearing that fully white dress, her hair styled, carrying herself like someone who had paid attention to how she would look in the context she was in. In that specific photo, without any prior context, it would have been a completely reasonable question to ask who the bride was. I closed the folder. I sat there with the laptop on my legs, staring at the black screen for a moment I didn't measure. What I felt then was different from what I had felt on the day of the wedding. That day I had been operating in handling mode, making quick decisions about what to do and what not to do in real time. Now there was nothing to handle. There was just a photo that existed and would continue to exist, documenting something in a way that could not be corrected. I called my mom that night. I described the photo before sending it, so she would know what she was looking at when she received it. Then I sent it and waited while she opened it and looked at it. The call took on that kind of silence phones have when the person on the other end is looking at something instead of listening. When she spoke, my mom said she understood why it upset me. She said the photo was what it was. And then she said she wanted me to consider the possibility that Vanessa simply hadn't fully understood how the dress would look that day, that maybe at home it looked one way and in the context of the wedding it looked different. I reminded her of the conversation in the cafe. I told her that Vanessa had shown me the dress, that I had specifically told her I preferred she not wear it, and that she had said she understood and would choose something else. I told her that conversation had happened 2 months before the wedding and had been completely clear on both sides. My mom stayed silent for several seconds. Then she said she hadn't known that conversation had happened. I told her it had. Another silence. Then she said that, in any case, she didn't believe Vanessa had done it with the intention of causing harm, that she knew her and that she wasn't that kind of person, that sometimes people make bad decisions without there being intent behind them. She said that without any malice. She said it in the way people speak when they are trying to find an interpretation of the world that doesn't require them to assume that someone they love did something deliberately harmful. It is a comprehensible need. I understand it completely. But it is also a need that, over the years, had created within our family an absence of any honest conversation about what Vanessa did and what it meant, and that absence had consequences that reached all the way to that moment. I ended the call without reaching any real conclusion. That night I told Daniel everything I had discussed with my mom. He listened to all of it. He asked if I wanted him to talk to Vanessa. I told him no, that it would create a dynamic I didn't want, that I wanted to speak to her directly. He told me that whatever I decided would be fine. The next day I called Vanessa. The conversation lasted more than an hour and belonged to that specific category of difficult conversations that are not difficult because the other person is shouting or aggressive, but because they have an answer for everything you say, and those answers are always just plausible enough on the surface to make insisting on your point seem irrational, but hollow enough at the core that accepting them feels like surrender. That the dress wasn't exactly the same shade as mine, that there was a difference even if it was small, that she remembered our conversation differently, that she believed I had said it was fine as long as it wasn't identical to mine, that if I had been clearer that I didn't want her to wear any shade of white at all, she would never have done it, that she was sorry if I had experienced it in a way that caused me discomfort, though she used that specific phrasing that is not quite an apology, but sounds like one. Every argument I made had its response. Every response was plausible when viewed in isolation, and I couldn't win that conversation with logic because the conversation wasn't about logic. It was about something that cannot be resolved in the format of a phone call, because it would require the other person to be willing to name something about themselves they are not willing to name. We hung up without reaching any real conclusion. No genuine apology. No acknowledgement of what had happened in the way it needed to be acknowledged. What I didn't know then was that the most revealing conversation wasn't that call. It was something I would discover a few days later that would completely change the scale of everything that had happened that day. The weeks after a wedding have a particular quality that is difficult to describe precisely to someone who hasn't lived it. Ordinary life resumes its rhythm quite quickly, work and routines and everyday commitments return to occupying the space that had been left open during the period of intense preparation, but you are still processing something that was enormous and that doesn't fully resolve itself just because the logistics of daily life have moved on. I was in that process, navigating the combination of genuine happiness at being married to Daniel and the weight of what had happened with Vanessa, which still didn't have a defined place to settle, when the photos from guests started arriving. Not the official photographer's photos, which I already had and had fully gone through. The personal ones, the pictures people take on their phones during a wedding and eventually share in group chats or send directly to the newly married couple as a gesture of affection. Those photos have a different quality from professional ones. They are more fragmented, more spontaneous, less controlled in terms of composition. But sometimes they capture things the official photographer doesn't, precisely because no one was thinking about them when they were taken. A family friend, someone who has known Vanessa since we were children and who attended the wedding with her husband, sent me a set of photos she had taken during the reception. She sent them along with a very warm message about how beautiful the wedding had been and how happy we looked. I opened the photos with no particular expectations and went through them one by one. In one of them, taken during dinner from the angle of her table, Vanessa appeared seated with two other people. She had her phone in her hand and was looking at the screen with an expression I recognized immediately, even though it took me a second to understand why I recognized it. It was the specific expression of someone who has just taken a photo of themselves and is checking how it turned out, the combination of focus and evaluation that has a different texture from someone simply reading a message. I wouldn't have thought anything of it in another context. People take photos at weddings. It's completely normal. But that same friend who sent me the photos also sent me, in the same message or immediately after, a screenshot of a social media post Vanessa had made. She sent it without any specific comment, just with a question mark emoji, which was a way of asking something without having to ask it directly. It was a post Vanessa had made that same night of the wedding. The time shown on the post was approximately 9:15 p.m., which was during the reception, while the party was still ongoing. She had posted a photo of herself alone. A photo where she was facing the camera, wearing that fully white dress, with the garden of my wedding clearly recognizable in the background. The lighting was good, the kind produced by the careful illumination of a well-organized event. The photo had clearly been taken with intention, with attention to framing and light. The caption said it had been a beautiful night and that it was an honor to celebrate the people you love. The photo had 70-something comments when my friend sent the screenshot. Most were from people who had no context for what had happened that day and were commenting on how elegant Vanessa looked or how beautiful the venue was. Some were asking what event it was. Several were from mutual acquaintances who recognized the setting and made comments like what a beautiful wedding or what a lovely dress. There was not a single mention that it was her sister's wedding, not a single reference to me. It was a photo of her, at my wedding, posted during my wedding, with me absent from the entire post. I stared at the screenshot for a time I didn't measure. What I processed in that time was the difference between what I had believed was possible and what had actually happened. Because wearing a white dress to your sister's wedding after she specifically asked you not to is one thing. Posting a photo of yourself in the dress in the garden of that wedding while the wedding is still happening is something entirely different, and the difference between the two is the difference between a bad decision and a deliberate gesture executed with enough attention to choose the right angle and wait for the right light. I showed the screenshot to Daniel that night. I watched him while he looked at it. His face went through several expressions in a relatively short amount of time, and the last one was that of someone who has arrived at a conclusion they don't like but cannot unsee. He asked me what I wanted to do. I told him I didn't know yet. And that was true, because what I wanted and what was reasonably possible did not align in any satisfying way. What I wanted was a conversation where Vanessa would name what she had done with complete honesty, without plausible explanations and reframing and alternative versions. What was possible was another conversation that would end the same way as the previous one, or silence and carrying something that didn't deserve silence, or distance with all the consequences that would have for the entire family dynamic, including my parents and people who loved both of us. I chose distance. Not in a dramatic way or with any formal declaration. I simply stopped initiating contact. When Vanessa wrote, I replied briefly, with the minimum that couldn't be interpreted as open hostility but also didn't invite continuation. I stopped suggesting plans. I stopped showing up in contexts where she would be if I could avoid it. I stopped talking about her with my mom as an active subject of processing, because that ongoing processing was itself a way of continuing to give central space to something I needed to occupy less space. My mom noticed after a few weeks. She asked if everything was okay between Vanessa and me. I told her we had taken a bit of distance, that we were fine but that dynamics change. It wasn't a complete lie. It was simply a version of the truth that didn't require me to reopen a conversation I had already tried to have and that had gone nowhere. There are people who, when I tell this story, tell me to let it go. That in the end the wedding was what it was and that the things that mattered about the day existed independently of what Vanessa did. I understand that perspective. In many ways I share part of it. That wedding had moments that are entirely mine and that no photo of Vanessa on social media can touch. But there is also something that doesn't disappear just because you decide you've processed it enough. What Vanessa did that day was not a lapse in judgment or a careless mistake. It was a sequence of decisions made with enough awareness to choose the timing of the post, the framing of the photo, and the caption that didn't mention me anywhere. I know that. And knowing that changes something in the way I see my sister that I can't unsee now that I've seen it. There are things you can forgive without them ceasing to be true. And there are people you can love while simultaneously understanding clearly what they are capable of. That combination is possible. It is uncomfortable and it doesn't have the clean resolution you would want, but it is completely possible. That is where I am with Vanessa. And it is probably where I will remain for a long time.